The sound was small at first, no louder than a quick inhale of surprise. But in the hollow, dust-laden villa, that gasp from a child's throat cut through silence like a flare in the dark. It echoed against broken walls, crumbled ceilings, beams that leaned like old men too tired to stand. You picture the place as nothing more than a husk, yet that one sharp breath told a different story. The boy had seen something hidden in the ruin, and it startled him enough to forget the numbness of grief that had been pressing at his chest since his mother's funeral. Why would a father bring his child here, into a home that looked more like rubble than shelter? That is the question that rises instantly, and for good reason. The roof sagged like a ship gone down in a storm. Paint peeled in sheets large enough to be mistaken for falling leaves. Sharp drafts whistled through cracks that stretched like scars along the walls. No father of sound mind would call such ruin a home. And yet, here they were, 2 lives adrift, clinging to stone that most people had abandoned long ago. The boy's gasp marks the true beginning, because it was not the sound of fear exactly. It carried wonder threaded with confusion. He had lifted his small hand toward a darkness between boards creeping along the floor. Something inside that gap had caught the light in a way too deliberate to be accident. The faintest glint, not dust, not a nail, something older, something waiting. The father, already weary from months of shouldering sorrow, turned sharply at the sound. His instincts told him to hush the boy, to keep moving past broken staircases and mangled shutters, to pretend that discovery had no place in such a bitterness-soaked purchase. He wanted only escape, an erasure of city memories where every street corner reminded him of the woman he lost. The villa offered that. An empty place with no echoes of her voice. At least, that was the plain reason, he told himself. But grief drives decisions in strange ways. Sometimes what looks reckless is simply the shape of a soul reaching for air. This house wasn't a choice of safety. It was a choice of desperation, perhaps even of punishment. Yet in that hollow where decay reigned, the boy's eyes widened at something real. And here's the twist. His small discovery hinted that the house held more than mildew and sorrow. Beneath decades of dust, it guarded a secret capable of shifting their lives forever. Think of grief like a locked chest. Heavy, sealed, impossible to pry open without breaking yourself in the attempt. The villa was such a chest, unwanted, forgotten, made dangerous by neglect. But the boy's gasp was the key sliding into the lock, turning it ever so slightly, because in his gaze lay promise. Buried in the ruin framed by grief was not just mold or broken stone. It was a path leading toward a fortune no one had dared to guess, one measured not just in money, but in meaning. So the boy's father heard that gasp and knew, though he would resist it, that life inside this ruin was about to change. And the story of a single dad stumbling into decay would become something else entirely, something that could only be told by starting right here, with a child's curious breath in the shadows of a collapsing home. When you lose the person you built your future around, even simple walls can feel like traps. The father knew this too well. After his wife's death, the city that once carried their laughter became an endless reminder of absence. Every storefront, every park bench, every bus stop carried her ghost. It was as if the streets themselves whispered her name back at him. relentless in their cruelty. For weeks he stumbled through routines, keeping up appearances for his son while inside he was crumbling. Bills piled up on the kitchen table. Sleepless nights left him glassy-eyed at work. Polite neighbors dropped hints about counseling and support groups, but none of it dulled the ache that gnawed at him. What he wanted most was escape, a place where memory did not choke him at every turn. So when word reached him of an abandoned villa far from the bustle, he did not see its broken windows or rotting rafters. He saw air, space, silence that did not carry his wife's voice at every corner. The price was absurdly low, practically begging to be taken by someone desperate enough. And desperate he was. Friends questioned his decision. Why gamble now, with a child to protect? He could not answer without admitting the truth, that grief had hijacked his logic. He told them the villa offered potential, a chance to repair and rebuild. In reality, his choice came from a darker wish, to inhabit a house so broken it reflected his own soul, to walk halls that leaned with sorrow, just as he leaned with exhaustion. The boy, younger and more malleable, did not see the ruin in such bleak terms. To him, the jagged cracks in the walls looked like pathways waiting to be drawn over. Fallen doors became secret gates to kingdoms of imagination. Where the father saw decay, the boy saw puzzles. Where the father recoiled from shadows, the boy leaned in, curious. This difference between them mattered more than either realized. The father craved an absence of memory. The child searched instinctively for presence, a sign, any sign, that something could still grow amidst ruins. And the villa offered both, depending on how you looked at it. On their first night, a single lamp barely cut through the dark. The kitchen smelled of mold buried deep in wood. Rats scratched faintly somewhere behind the plaster. The father laid a blanket on the floor for his son and whispered stories, not to entertain, but to keep fear at bay. When he closed his eyes, guilt pressed down. What kind of protector leads his child into this? Still he clung to one fragile thought. At least here, no corner screamed of his wife's lost laughter. By day, he forced himself into action, hauling boards, hammering nails, sweeping glass from cracked tile. Each strike of the hammer was less about repair and more about protest. If he worked hard enough, maybe grief itself would relent. Every plank nailed down felt like he was sealing sorrow underneath it. He poured himself into projects that no one asked of him. The boy took another path. He wandered with pockets full of stray nails, imagining them as coins from a different age. He tapped on walls, listening for the music of hollow spaces. Sometimes he crouched by broken banisters just to trace patterns in the dust. He carried a small notebook where he drew shapes that caught his eye, spirals in wood, faint carvings, a slanted crossbeam that looked like a secret sign. The father grew impatient with these wanderings. He wanted his son to stay close, safe, focused on chores that mattered. But what he did not see was how those small drawings, those curious eyes, kept the boy afloat. Grief weighed heavily on both of them, but the boy's way of carrying it was different, by searching for mystery rather than hiding from memory. That tension simmered quietly. Every time the boy tilted his head toward an unfamiliar mark, every time his gaze lingered too long on crumbled plaster, the father would call him back with a sigh that sounded closer to beg than command. Yet somewhere deep beyond his fatigue, the father recognized the spark still burning in his child. He feared it, at the same time he envied it. The villa stood between them like a mirror, two sets of eyes seeing the same walls but finding opposite truths. For one, the house meant concealment of sorrow. For the other, it meant discovery. And though neither said it aloud, both understood this was not merely a home. It was the line they walked between despair and new life, a line as fragile as the cracked beams above their heads. So the father pressed on, holding back the tide of collapse with little more than nails and stubbornness, while the boy quietly mapped a new world in his mind. Two pursuits under the same broken roof, both born of loss, both searching for a path forward. The days that followed settled into an uneasy rhythm. The villa groaned in the wind as if it were alive, joints creaking louder at night than during the day. The father attacked repairs with single-minded force. He stripped boards, hammered nails, stacked bricks wherever something looked ready to fall apart. Yet for every piece he tried to mend, 3 more demanded attention. It was endless work, and it consumed him. The boy, however, didn't see just debris. He slipped away from the noise of tools and walked softly through halls where paint curled into long ribbons. To him, every crack carried a story. He pressed his ear against walls and whispered as though they might whisper back. What he noticed first was the music of emptiness, the way certain spots gave off a tone when tapped, deeper and more hollow than the rest. He tugged at his father's sleeve one afternoon, blurting that something behind the wallpaper didn't sound real, that it was hiding space. The father only grunted, wiping sweat from his brow, muttering about mold and insulation. He couldn't afford to entertain fantasies, but the boy's eyes narrowed, not in disobedience, but in quiet determination. Another time, climbing on the edge of a crumbling stair, he caught faint etchings scratched into the plaster. Tiny marks, almost like numbers, repeated in rhythm. He traced them with his finger, feeling the grooves worn by someone long before. He showed his father, who barely glanced before brushing it away as children's scrawl. To him it was nothing but graffiti from squatters, but in the boy's mind, carvings meant clues. The villa's decay spoke in other ways, too. Windows sealed shut rattled when no wind reached them. Doors swung open by themselves, slow and deliberate, like unseen hands testing rusty hinges. One evening, when dusk dipped the halls into shadow, the boy leaned over the threshold of an unused wing of the house. A wooden beam blocked the hallway, nailed there decades ago, and behind it, the dark spread dense and unbroken. He felt air seeping through, cold and salt-tinged, yet there were no windows at the far end. His skin prickled. He told his father about the icy draft. Again came the same refrain, that old houses breathe, that broken seals let air wander. Logical, reasonable, but logic didn't match what he felt against his palms, air moving from something hidden deeper in the villa. He stared long into the gap, eyes burning with the wish to see more, but fear also curled in his chest. It was as if the house was testing him, daring him to step further than his father allowed. At night, when rats pattered along the rafters and the father's snores echoed through thin blankets, the boy replayed every odd detail he had seen. The grooves in plaster, the hollow places behind paint, the cold breath of sealed wings. Each moment stacked like pieces of a puzzle he wasn't supposed to solve. He clutched his notebook and began sketching shapes, connecting them with lines that crossed the page in nervous patterns. Meanwhile, the father drove himself to exhaustion. He saw only bills, supplies, nails bent wrong, and beams far too heavy to carry alone. When his son tugged on his sleeve yet again, begging him to look of all things at soundless echoes in the wall, he snapped, "We don't have time for shadows." The boy fell silent, but the sting pressed deep. Shadows were all he had left to hope in. Still, silence did not erase signs. The villa itself insisted on being noticed. Damp spots grew in shapes that resembled doors. Dust fell in strands as if someone upstairs dragged heavy objects over floors. There were nights when the boy swore he heard faint footsteps in sealed corridors. He clutched his blanket tighter, tempted to shout for his father, but unwilling to be dismissed once more. Instead, he whispered to the dark, asking who was there. Of course, no answer came. Only the heavy pause of a house remembering too much. The contrast between father and child grew sharper each day. One saw tasks, costs, and tight deadlines. The other saw mystery blooming in every crack. Yet something beneath their arguments hinted that both were right. Old houses do breathe, and sometimes that breath carries secrets still alive. The boy learned to keep discoveries quiet. When he spotted faint rings burned into floorboards, he crouched low with pencil in hand, tracing circles into his notebook. He imagined them as markers left by someone using fire as code. His father passed by, hauling a plank, and shook his head at what looked like careless doodles. The boy said nothing. This quiet hiding stretched into habit. He slipped scraps of information into drawings, a hatch pattern, a series of dots, a bent beam with strange iron nails unlike the rest. Each small detail slid into his secret archive. He wasn't brave enough yet to confront the sealed hallway or chip at plaster, not while his father guarded doors against distraction. But he held everything together in his notebook, waiting for a moment when facts could no longer be dismissed. Here's the thing. The early signs were not dramatic. They weren't ghosts floating down halls or jewels spilling through cracks. They were small touches, easy to miss, easy to sweep aside while swinging hammers. But like a drip of water on stone, they gathered strength in repetition. Every hollow echo, every draft, every faint mark whispered, "This villa hides something." The boy already believed. The father refused, but refusal cannot silence truth forever. So with every day passing, while dust clouded light and the father cursed bent nails, the child's eyes sharpened. Curiosity grew to hunger, and the villa, with all its weary bones, seemed to lean in closer, as though it too was eager for its story to be uncovered. The boy's notebook thickened with sketches, each line bold where curiosity refused to fade. But one afternoon, while rummaging through a half-rotted desk shoved against the wall of what once had been a study, he found something he hadn't drawn. It was there, hidden in an old drawer stuck fast with damp swelling. With a grunt and a squeak, he forced it open. Out spilled paper brittle as dry leaves. Most fragments dissolved to dust at his touch, but one sheet, folded tight and tucked deep, held together. He gasped again, that same breath of wonder the house had already coaxed from him once before. Creases mapped the page like scars, and ink, though faded, still whispered shapes. Rough outlines of walls, thick squares suggesting foundations. Symbols clustered along one side. A narrow, winding line reached into a part of the drawing where no windows or doors had ever been visible in the real villa. He darted to his father, waving the sheet. "Look!" "It's the house. Someone drew it, but there's something underneath. See that line?" His words tumbled over each other, spilling out faster than air could fill his chest. The father, bent over a cracked doorframe with hammer in hand, turned slowly. He took the page with reluctant fingers, barely glancing before his shoulders sank. It's just an old plan. Workers leave things behind, probably nothing. He started to hand it back, eyes clouded with fatigue. But it shows stairs. Look, they go down, not up. They lead to something. The boy pressed closer, eyes wide. He pointed at the symbols, spirals, squares, a strange star. None resembled labels or measurements. They looked more like signs, purposeful but veiled. The father let out a long breath, gaze drifting to the broken window rimmed with ivy. People scribble nonsense. This isn't a treasure map. It's moldy paper. That's all. He returned to the doorframe with a forceful swing of his hammer, the blow loud enough to silence further argument. But silence never settled inside the boy. His fingers traced the shapes again and again, memorizing every curl. He tucked the paper flat between pages of his notebook, where it joined his own sketches. To him, the symbols weren't nonsense. They were pieces of a puzzle bigger than himself. That night, while his father slept, he spread the page on the floor. He set it beside his notebook drawings of hollow-sounding walls, odd drafts, sealed corridors. The lines matched. Spaces on the map landed near the places he had felt openings that his father denied. The paper didn't mock him. It confirmed him. He whispered to the shadows, "It's real." The house seemed to respond. A floorboard snapped deep in the dark hall, too far to climb out of bed and investigate, but close enough to quicken his heart. By morning, the boy hesitated to share again. His father's temper, brewed from exhaustion and grief, left little room for dreams, yet he could not let the map fade. Over breakfast of stale bread and jam, he laid it quietly at the edge of the table. The father glanced once, chewing without a word. He looked more worn than ever, as though the villa itself drained him. Finally, he muttered, "I know what you're hoping, but we have to live in the world, not in stories." His eyes dropped, heavy with shadows. The boy clenched the map. But what if this is the world? What if someone lived here before us who wanted us to find it? The father pushed up from the table and gathered his tools. We're here to restore, not to chase ghosts. The boy slumped, feeling banished. But deep down, questions burned hotter. Who drew the map? Why fold it away in a hidden drawer? What was sealed in the walls? Storage, passage, or something else entirely? Later that week, as rain spattered the villa's cracked roof, he studied the page again. If the drawing showed more than walls, then what waited beneath the floorboards? His pulse thrilled at the thought. To a grieving child, purpose was oxygen. And this puzzle whispered purpose, louder than anything else since his mother died. He tested the theory in whispers with himself. If someone drew this, they wanted someone after to know. Maybe they hid it because they couldn't tell aloud. His imagination conjured shadowed figures walking the halls long ago, clutching boxes heavy with secrets, muttering about the one who would discover them in another lifetime. Even as fear prodded him, fear of collapse, fear of anger from his father, he felt a rush of belonging. For the first time since her death, his life aligned with a sense of destiny. It wasn't about running from sorrow anymore. It was about following these marks wherever they led. Meanwhile, the father noticed the boy's gaze lingering too often on folded paper. He grew restless with unease. Loss had already stripped away so much. What if this search for shadows pulled his son further from reality? At night, staring at cracked ceilings, he wrestled with a paradox. He wanted to shield his child from disappointment. Yet each time he tried to dismiss the map, guilt stabbed him. Who was he now, if he crushed wonder in the eyes of the one person left who depended on him? The villa loomed over their quarrel like a silent judge. Its hollow chambers seemed to wait, patient and knowing, as father and child danced between denial and belief. On one particular afternoon, the boy sat by the boarded hallway, map in hand, comparing lines against doors sealed shut. If the sketch was right, just behind that barricade lay a stairwell leading deeper. He pressed his ear to the boards, half expecting voices centuries old. He heard nothing, but the weight of secrets pressed against him all the same. He whispered, "We'll find you." Even if his father wouldn't say it, the boy knew. This house was speaking through the paper. It carried questions too sharp to ignore. And though he had no clear answers yet, the direction was set. The ruin wasn't just home. It was a riddle, sealed inside wood and stone, waiting for the one who refused to be silenced. The boy could not let it go. From the moment the paper map slipped into his notebook, curiosity grew inside him like a vine curling through cracks of stone. It didn't matter that his father dismissed it. The more resistance he met, the stronger the need became. In secret, he began testing the villa, pressing, tapping, looking for spaces that lined up with the sketch. He walked barefoot so the creak of boards wouldn't give him away. His hands traced beams, fingers finding grooves no tool of his father's had cut. He began to see patterns, small triangles carved into the thresholds, not decoration, but deliberate marks, placed where no one would notice unless they searched. He copied each one into his notebook, beside the fold lines of the old map. Connections formed in his mind, a puzzle surfacing from the ruin. At dusk, when the tired father set down tools, the boy squeezed behind furniture too heavy for one man to move. Dust clung to his hair and clothes, but his eyes shone. In one corner of the parlor, pressed flat against the wall, he found a panel darkened with age. Unlike surrounding planks, this piece bore scratches clustered along the edge, as if countless attempts had been made to grip it open. His pulse surged. Someone had hidden something here. He whispered to himself, "This is it." He tested the seams, pushing with fingers, but the board held tight. The scent of aged wood filled his nostrils, bitter as ash. For a long time he crouched there, trembling, both thrilled and frightened. If he pulled too hard, the panel might shatter, and his father might notice at once. So he memorized the feel, promising himself he would return. Later, when he mentioned casually that one part of the wall looked different, the father spun on him in anger. "You need to stop this. We live here now. It's a home, not some game." His voice cracked sharper than he intended, grief wrapped inside frustration. The boy's shoulders drooped, eyes stinging, but the fire in him didn't die. It smoldered, stronger. The father thought such scolding would protect his son from disappointment. Secretly, though, even he had noticed oddities. Sometimes, while working on beams, he sensed hollow echoes beneath stone. Sometimes the hair on his arms rose when a draft rushed through a space with no opening. But to admit it would be to give his boy's obsession a green light, and he feared what discovery might take from them. Still, new signs pressed forward. One afternoon, the child spotted strange iron nails hammered into the banister at intervals, different from the rest, thicker, blunt, almost ceremonial. They didn't hold weight. They marked. He felt certain of it. He tapped them and sensed faint vibration answering from the floors below. Another night, with lantern low by his blanket, he placed the map over his own sketches and saw alignment too perfect for chance. The hollow-sounding wall matched the doodles, and the nails lined like coordinates. By now, obsession claimed every quiet breath. While his father scrubbed mildew, the boy tested screws and panels. While his father muttered over accounts, he chased shadows with pencil. He dreamed of opening that sealed panel, of stepping into dark stairwells, spiraling down into the unknown. His father noticed the gleam each time the boy lifted his notebook, and doubt tugged at him. Was it right to smother that joy, even if it risked leading nowhere? At night, as sleep eluded him, he wondered whether loss had fossilized him while his son, resilient as spring grass, reached for something larger. Morning came. The boy rose earlier than his father. He crept toward the blocked hallway, the one with beams nailed decades ago. Kneeling, he pressed his cheek against cool wood. Beyond it, silence swelled, dense as a held breath. He slid the map edge beneath the beam as if it were a key, eyes closing, imagining the staircase marked faintly on the paper. Later, during chores, he tried again. Dad, what if this place isn't just ruins? What if someone hid things here months, maybe centuries ago? His father's gaze darkened. Stop. This house has taken all we have. I won't let it take your mind, too. His words were final, heavy as slammed doors. The boy fell mute, carrying ache and longing in silence. But his hunger didn't vanish. Instead, he sank deeper, storing every pattern, every hollow echo. The map became heartbeat to him, reminding him that they weren't just squatting in a ruin. They were participants in a riddle set long before their grief. To anyone else, it was dust, rot, and broken rafters. To him, every scar in the timber was language. Every draft was whisper. He couldn't prove it yet, but he knew. The villa was alive with more than sorrow, and sooner or later, even his father would see. Rain came down that evening like fists on the roof. The villa had always creaked, but under the weight of this storm, its joints howled, rafters strained with the sound of wood crying. Wind rushed through cracks with the force of snarling animals. The father was already tense, each thunderclap rattling his tools on the crooked shelf. He checked buckets catching leaks until one loud crack split the air inside the walls. Not thunder from the sky, something built into the house itself. The boy jumped up from his blanket. His wide eyes sparked with certainty. That was it. That's where the map points, he whispered, trembling not with fear but anticipation. He darted toward the parlor wall where hairline cracks zigzagged above the old furniture. Rainwater slid down plaster, loosening dust that drifted in wavering clouds. The father called him back sharply. Stay away from that. He hurried after, but when he pressed his own palm against the wall, he felt it. Wood shuddering where no hollow should exist. A strip of ceiling had sagged, dragging down a beam, creating a gap near the seams of old plaster. The boy touched it with reverence while his father muttered, "It's dangerous." The whole thing could give. But the boy was insistent. "It matches. Look, the map said stairs, right here." His voice cut straight through the storm. Something in his tone, earnest, almost pleading, held the father in place. He looked between his son's eager face and the trembling boards. Against every instinct, screaming to keep the boy safe, he realized he couldn't deny it this time. They fetched tools together. The father lifted the lantern, shadows swallowing half his face as he pressed the crowbar against warped wood. Each pull echoed like groans from the house's bones. Moisture-softened timber splintered until an edge gave way, revealing a black breath crawling out. Cold air damp with centuries untouched. The boy exhaled in awe. He leaned close while his father steadied him, muttering warnings. They pushed further. Boards cracked open, dust erupting like spores. The storm outside disguised their noise, so it felt as though they worked within another world, suspended away from time. Inch by inch, the opening widened into a jagged frame showing stone steps dropping into shadow. Neither moved for a pause. Rain hammered overhead. Their lantern flame trembled. The boy whispered, "We found it." The father swallowed hard. He couldn't argue. The evidence stood undeniable. Still, dread kept him rooted. "A stairway into the foundation," he said low, "might just lead to a storage pit." Yet, even as words left his lips, he knew he didn't believe them. They cleared enough space to crawl through. He tested the first stone step with cautious weight. It held. Dust showered his boots. "Stay behind me," he commanded, voice thick. But he reached for his son's hand anyway. The boy clasped tightly, small fingers eager despite fear. Their descent began. Lantern light licked stone walls slick with damp. The air grew colder, thicker, as if it had never known breath. Thunder above seemed distant, as though they'd already stepped away from the world. Each stair creaked like brittle ice, honestly too narrow for comfort. Spiderwebs brushed their cheeks. Pebbles rolled underfoot. Halfway down, the father paused, almost choking on the closeness of air. He hated that his hands trembled visibly. The boy, pressed close behind, whispered in awe, "This was here the whole time." "Under our feet every night." His words carried such wonder, the father couldn't cut him short with logic this time. They reached a landing no bigger than a closet. At the far wall, lantern glow revealed metal studded like scales across an enormous frame. It was a door, broad and unnatural in this hidden place, its surface crusted with decay. Along the edges sprawled carvings faintly visible in the light, swirls, stars, and unfamiliar symbols echoing the very ones marked on the map. The boy gasped aloud, trembling with excitement. His hand lifted instinctively toward the lock, but the father grabbed him back, careful. He leaned in himself, studying the mechanism. There wasn't a keyhole in the simple sense, only a complex interplay of bolts rusted shut, layered like puzzles. Centuries of weight held this entrance hostage. His chest tightened. Here it was, proof undeniable, truth he had refused again and again. They had broken through to it together. Yet dread poured through him with equal force, questions piled against his chest. Who had built such a vault? What it guarded? Why it had remained sealed? More than that, why fate demanded his son be the one to uncover it. The boy whispered reverently, "It's waiting for us." His eyes gleamed in lantern flame, reflecting childhood hope free of calculation. The father did not answer. He touched the cold metal and felt not ownership, but weight. His mind flicked through possible dangers, traps, collapse, sickness waiting behind untouched air. He thought of legalities, of officials who would claim everything, of eyes turning on a fragile family already scarred by loss. Yet, he looked at his son and saw something vivid he had nearly lost himself. Belief in life carrying value beyond sorrow. Above them, the storm cracked. Dust drifted from ceilings long buried. The lantern wavered but held steady. For a long breath, neither spoke. They just stared at the door, listening to silence louder than thunder. Finally, the father said, voice low, "We're not opening it tonight." He pressed the lantern higher, traced symbols with his gaze one last time, then turned carefully up the stairs. The boy followed reluctantly, glancing back so many times it seemed his heart remained below with that strange door. When they pushed the last board aside and returned to the parlor, wind roared louder, branches lashing windows. Both of them blinked in the ordinary dark of their ruined home, the ordinary sounds of storm. And yet everything had shifted. There was no pretending anymore. The villa was not only decay, it was keeper of secrets, and their lives would never return to silence again. The boy clutched the map against his chest, eyes burning bright. The father sat heavily on a beam, rubbing dusty hands through his hair. He whispered, almost to himself, "So it's real." He looked at his son, who smiled faintly despite exhaustion. Something passed between them, not agreement necessarily, but acknowledgement. The house moaned around them, battered by rain, as if congratulating their discovery, or perhaps warning them. For the first time since his wife's death, the father felt both fear and anticipation mingling in his blood. He recognized that the path forward could not be shut off. Whether he was ready or not, their story had broken open along with the wall, and nothing could close it again. The villa grew quiet once the storm passed, but sleep eluded both father and son. Lantern light had revealed more than stone steps. It had unveiled the truth that everything strange the child noticed was no invention. The hidden chamber below them was real. When morning came, silence stretched between them like a delicate binding. The boy's eyes begged to return downstairs. The father's hands shook over his tools, refusing that reality. By afternoon he relented, not from eagerness, but from the knowledge that silence could no longer contain what they had seen. They began the descent again, this time armed with steadier lamps and a rope tied at the entrance for safety. The boy's heart raced in delight, though nerves twisted deep in his belly. His father placed each foot with deliberate care. The stone steps seemed narrower than before, slick with age. Every echo of their movement magnified against walls, as if unseen ears listened. At the bottom, the door loomed even larger in daylight's absence, its metal bruised by centuries. This time the father forced himself to inspect more closely. He ran fingertips across rusted mechanisms, pressed palms against hinges. With enough leverage, he thought, the door might yield. But each strike of his crowbar rang hollow, mocking effort. Finally, with sweat beading his brow, he found the trick. Several bolts arranged not as locks, but as a sequence. Sliding one released tension on another until a faint shift stuttered through the frame. A groan, long and low, filled the chamber. The boy stepped forward, clutching his father's arm. "It's opening," he whispered, eyes glowing. The father nodded, though unease crawled his spine. They heaved together, timber muscles straining, until the vault creaked open by inches. Air, thick and metallic, gushed into their faces, damp, sour, tasting of stone sealed from the sun for generations. For several breaths, neither moved. Then the boy squeezed through the gap, his father right behind. Inside, darkness swallowed them. Lamp flames carved narrow tunnels of gold into the black. The chamber stretched farther than expected, arched ceilings braced by pillars of rough-hewn stone. Dust cascaded with each step, particles swirling like ghosts. The man raised his lamp higher. Shapes emerged, wooden chests stacked in awkward piles, iron hinges half-eaten with corrosion. Some lids sagged open, spilling contents into dirt. The boy gasped, a sound halfway between wonder and fear. He knelt before the nearest chest. At first, he thought it filled with coins from a child's game, dull and stuck together. As he brushed dust away, gleam returned. Golden discs caught light, so many they clinked like falling rain. He scooped a handful, weight shocking in his palm. "They're real," he breathed. His father crouched beside him, eyes darting. He too lifted a coin, flipping it with trembling fingers. Not toys, not counterfeit, genuine. History whispered through each mark etched on their surfaces. Another chest lay split open, revealing velvet pouches spilling gemstones across centuries of dirt. Red, green, and blue flames flickered in lamplight. The boy grinned wide, scooping one up, holding it against his eye. His father pulled his hand gently away. "Careful," he murmured, voice shaking. His mind stormed with contradictions. This was salvation, this was danger. Wealth of staggering measure, and with it, peril he could not yet name. They moved deeper. Scrolls bundled in leather lay stacked against walls, brittle but legible. Faded ink sketched transactions, drawings of the villa, signatures lost to time. The father skimmed them quickly, heart pounding. He sensed more than treasure here. He sensed context, proof that these riches belonged to someone whose name would matter to history. Each record tied the hoard not to random luck, but to deliberate concealment. Perhaps someone had hidden fortunes during war, or noble families had disguised assets while fleeing collapse. Whatever the reason, they chose secrecy so complete it lasted until now. The father lowered one scroll and looked around, eyes wide in awe, but hollowed with fear. This changes everything. His whisper echoed against stone. The boy didn't hear fear, though. He only heard hope. "We're not poor anymore," he said eagerly. "We could fix the whole house. We could buy anything." He twirled in circles, gemstones spilling from tiny fingers like sparks. For him, discovery meant freedom. For his father, it meant questions of ownership, law, and overwhelming exposure. He pictured neighbors, newspapers, officials arriving, stripping away privacy. He imagined strangers debating in court while his son's joy twisted into spectacle. The thought stung. Until now, he wanted distance from the world, a quiet refuge. Now fate shoved them into glare brighter than sunlight. Still, a flicker rose inside him. Months of grief carved him hollow. Yet in this cavern, holding gold heavier than his doubts, and watching his son beam brighter than he had since his wife's death, he felt stirrings of possibility. Perhaps the villa, chosen as mirror for his sorrow, had transformed into a vessel of healing, as though his reckless decision carried unseen purpose, guiding them toward renewal their hearts needed. But shadows remained. They explored further, uncovering weapons rusted to lumps, relics of some forgotten fear. The boy nearly pressed his hands to one, but his father stopped him. "These were hidden with violence as companion," he said. The boy frowned, sensing weight beyond treasure. Even he could understand secrets bought with blood. He stepped back, clutching a gemstone tightly, unwilling to surrender wonder, but unable to deny the chill accompanying it. They lingered long, cataloging discoveries in quiet awe. At last, the father declared, "We must leave this undisturbed until we know what to do." His son pouted, but obeyed, slipping one coin into his pocket when his father's eyes turned. For the boy, it was a talisman, proof that wonder wasn't illusion. For the father, leaving was an act of prudence, an attempt to preserve sanity. Yet, as they ascended the narrow stair again, rope swaying behind, both knew life above would never resemble life before. Back in the parlor, dust trailing their clothes, silence pressed heavy. They stared at each other, searching language to frame what they had seen. Finally, the father spoke. "This house chose us," he said softly. He meant it half as metaphor, half as surrender. His son nodded eagerly, grin unshakable. "Mom would have loved it," the boy whispered suddenly. Tears burned the father's eyes. The villa, once only an escape from her echoes, had brought her presence back, reshaped into shared purpose. They sat amid ruin, embracing both sorrow and hope, aware that outside world might one day demand claim. For now, though, in the quiet aftermath of discovery, they held a secret too immense to measure. A weight of 250 million, not only in gold, but in meaning. It wasn't mere fortune hidden beneath their feet. It was redemption, transformation, a chance to heal as much as a chance to change destiny. News never stays locked under stone, no matter how tightly sealed. Within days of their discovery, the father's whispered fear came true. The secret bled outward. It started innocently, with a slip. He sought advice from a local official on structural safety, unable to shoulder the looming vault alone. Soon whispers turned to gossip to chatter, and chatter to hungry attention none of them could control. The first visitors arrived quietly, archaeologists, carrying clipboards and earnest eyes. They claimed to care only for history, but the gleam reflecting in their spectacles betrayed another hunger, the size of the find, the world's valuation. The boy clung to his father's sleeve, uneasy at strangers crowding the threshold of the place that had been theirs alone. For weeks, villa hallways once echoing only their steps, now hummed with boots, with the strange scratching of pens. The town surrounding the villa split into factions. Some hailed the find as miraculous, declaring the family saviors of heritage. Others whispered suspicion. Perhaps the father fabricated, perhaps they looted a past that was never theirs. Neighbors who once ignored the villa now leaned against fences, desperate for a glance at what had been pulled from hiding. The quiet refuge had become center stage. Television vans rumbled up muddy paths. Cameras gleamed like weaponry, aimed at the boy's wide eyes. He felt small, both proud and stripped bare. Smiles tugged his lip, but quickly faltered when flashbulbs blinded him. His father placed protective hands on his shoulders, trying to shield him from the sea of questions. Each reporter spoke of fortune measured in millions, But none asked how grief had led him here, how loss had carved the choices behind this broken home. Inside, experts cataloged artifacts with clinical detachment. Chests of coins, gemstones, documents layered with centuries. The vault became less a secret and more a spectacle. Items were removed carefully, boxed, labeled. Officials muttered valuations that climbed until they named a sum staggering: 250 million. The number echoed through rooms once filled only with dust. It settled on the father's tongue like ash. For the boy, though, it was magic confirmed. He overheard voices speak of museums, exhibitions, history rewritten. His chest swelled with pride. His notebook of sketches and his stubborn persistence had led them here. Still, he also ached. Each artifact lifted into strange hands felt stolen away from the bond he and his father had forged in the dark chamber. Community debates flared. Some believed the fortune belonged to the nation, woven into collective history. Others argued property rights, that the family who owned the villa owned also its secrets. Petitions circulated, court whispers echoed, and every conversation in town seemed to circle back to them. The father, once a man desperate only to disappear into silence, now found his name on strangers' tongues. One evening, exhausted, he stood in the courtyard with his boy. Beyond broken gates, journalists shouted questions. He whispered, "I wanted peace. Now look." His son touched his hand and said softly, "But we found it together. Mom would want us to share." The words pierced him tenderly. Perhaps sharing was kindness, yet each act of surrender tightened the knot of vulnerability strangling him. Government agents soon established control. Uniforms marched where ivy once sprawled. They erected barriers, partly for protection, partly for possession. The boy felt the villa slipping from him, becoming less home and more exhibit. Officials spoke in terms of claims, heritage acts, legal ownership, a language cold against the warm thrill he once carried. Still, as experts unraveled the villa's hidden past, stories surfaced that cooled even skeptical hearts. Records hinted at wartime smuggling, families shielding wealth from chaos, locking fortunes away to preserve fragments of their world. There were notes of noble lineage, of inheritance swallowed by conflict. These walls had protected not only gold, but memory. That revelation softened some suspicion, painting the father and child less as opportunists, more as chosen stewards, touched by strange destiny. The valuation of treasures climbed in official reports until it steadied around that staggering figure, 250 million. Letters stacked high on their doorstep, offers, demands, pleas, cautions. The father lost sleep, pacing halls now invaded by officials during daytime. He longed for the quiet decay that once engulfed them, twisted irony though it was. The boy, meanwhile, basked in his classmates' awe when news filtered through. He was no longer only the kid who lost his mother, but the kid who discovered treasure in a villa. Pride swelled, yet conflicted with nerves. A tension felt heavy, sometimes cruel. He enjoyed the shine of recognition, while also pining for secret moments alone with carvings in wood, whispers through cracks. Every night, father and child sat together, whispering about choices. Accept officials' rulings or fight for ownership. Retreat to privacy or embrace new paths. The father, protective to the core, feared losing what mattered most: their fragile bond mending after loss. Wealth threatened to divide, to drown them in noise. Yet he also saw new chances, education for his son, repairs for the villa, a future where despair no longer anchored them. Here's the thing. Fortune rarely erupts in isolation. Like a stone cast in a pond, ripples stretch far beyond the splash. Their secret, once gasped into life by a boy exploring shadows, now became a saga felt through courts, museums, neighbors, even historians tracing lost lines of heritage. What began as an escape from grief wound outward into a transformation none could contain. One late night, the father stayed awake long after his son fell asleep. From the upstairs window, he watched officials' lights glow outside. Stars shone faint, drowned by human incandescence. He whispered to the silent beams of the villa, "We only wanted quiet." But maybe this is what healing looks like. Not silence, but sharing. His breath fogged glass already cracked, and in silence he admitted what he had resisted. Discovery had forced growth neither hammer nor nail could achieve. By dawn, he resolved to walk balance, guard his son's heart against the consuming fire of media and wealth, while allowing history to breathe free of secrecy. It was imperfect, a fragile tightrope. But grief had taught him imperfection was all one could hope for. So the villa shifted again. No longer just ruins, not merely treasure vault. It became crossroads of past and present, private sorrow and public wonder. For the father, it meant surrender of secrecy. For the son, it meant proof that childhood wonder can outlast doubt. For the world, it meant revival of forgotten narratives locked away in dust. Their lives, once hidden in shadows of collapse, now glowed beneath brightest light. And while fear still gnawed in quiet hours, both knew ripples cannot be undone once the stone has been cast. The secret under their feet had risen, transforming not only villa and family, but the very world watching from beyond. When the officials withdrew at last, leaving fences and warnings but fewer boots on the floorboards, silence returned. Not the hushed despair of their earliest days in the villa, but a quieter tone threaded with renewal. For father and son, the house no longer felt like an enemy. It had become something far stranger. Part wound, part wonder, part second chance. The father walked its halls differently now. Where once he saw only cost, now he traced walls with something closer to reverence. He no longer dismissed every carving or echo. He leaned close, studying them as though the villa itself were whispering history meant to be honored. It surprised him. Months ago, grief had nailed his heart shut, but fortune's secret had pried loose those boards. His hands still shook when he thought of looming courts and the fiery weight of attention. Yet within the ruin he felt steadier. His son felt the change too. Recognition spread far beyond their town. Letters from schools and museums claimed him discoverer, young historian. Accolades that made pride bloom, but also pressed heavy on his small shoulders. He wasn't only a boy grieving his mother now. He was the child who proved the villa lived. Cameras caught his shy smiles. Reporters asked him what treasure felt like. At night, he sometimes trembled from the burden, crawling into his father's arms. "It's too big sometimes," he whispered. The father held him and answered, "Then it's mine to carry." And in the morning the boys' laughter rang a little freer, lighter, made possible by that promise. They began repairs anew, not driven merely by survival, but by purpose. Beams were straightened, not crudely nailed, but patiently restored. Windows cleaned until sunlight could stretch long inside. Vines trimmed back so the courtyard breathed again. At first, workers hired by officials swarmed the villa, but soon father and son insisted on lifting hammers themselves, reclaiming ownership through sweat. Each plank set into place echoed a vow. They would not let history's glare strip this home from them. Neighbors who once whispered suspicion gradually visited with gifts of food or hands for labor. The community shifted opinion, seeing not intruders, but guardians of something larger than themselves. The boy walked proudly through town now, though red-cheeked at friendly teasing. He learned that recognition was double-edged, a glow of importance, but also a reminder that eyes always followed. Inside, changes carried deeper meaning. The father noticed the boys' notebooks had grown thick with drawings not only of maps, but of their daily life. Repaired stairs, flowers sprouting in soil turned fresh. Even pictures of the two of them cooking in the kitchen. Treasure had given him adventure, but home had given him stability. The father tucked those notebooks away like treasures more fragile than coins. The villa itself transformed almost symbolically. Where water once cascaded through cracks, now glass panes kept rooms dry. Where rats had scurried, now laughter echoed as tools clattered. The house that mirrored death gradually mirrored resilience. Standing in the courtyard one evening, the father murmured, "It doesn't bend under sorrow anymore. It stands." His son nodded, gaze fixed on ivy curling up stone like veins of green life. Despite legal battles, a portion of discovered wealth was promised to remain with them, enough to reshape the home, enough to secure stability. They refused lavish excess, channeling resources into mending rather than flaunting. Reporters asked why they didn't abandon the villa now that riches could buy comfort elsewhere. The father always answered, "Because it gave us more than money. It gave us back our lives." Simple words, but they quieted the clamor. Inside themselves, something healed too. The father began speaking of his wife again, not with the wince of pain, but with gentler breath. He told his sons stories while working, how she once painted by the river, how she laughed loud at clumsy mistakes. For a long time he had locked such words away, afraid they would pierce wounds too deep. Now he saw that remembrance itself was part of survival. The boy listened with glowing eyes. Sometimes he even sketched her beside their villa, as though her presence still lingered in every corner. Together, they formed rituals of renewal. Each weekend, they cooked in the slowly revived kitchen and carried meals into the courtyard, sitting where broken tiles now gleamed under lanterns. They made lists of repairs to come, dreamt aloud of gardens, of bookshelves restored. Every plan stitched father and son together, each act of care transforming ruins into sanctuary. Of course, weight of fortune still loomed. Papers signed, agreements drafted. Curators still asked for artifacts. Some days, the father's shoulders sagged with bureaucracy, his patience fraying. But whenever fear returned, he looked at his son, racing blissfully across the courtyard, or sprawled in sunlight reading letters from curious children around the world. And he remembered, Grief had not won. They were still here, building. Transformation did not mean forgetting loss. Photographs of his wife remained on the mantel, restored from debris. But now her smile didn't slice him open. It steadied him. He whispered to her picture in the evenings, "We've made it livable again." And he believed she too would marvel at the secret buried beneath their feet. The secret that forced them to choose life when sorrow might have swallowed them whole. In time, the villa stood proud again. Once ridiculed as ruin, then seized as spectacle, it became what the boy always sensed, a place layered with stories, waiting to shelter new laughter as much as it preserved old secrets. Visitors came, yes, but father and son walked them proudly through, hosts rather than prey. And, most critical, the family healed. The boy carried pride tempered by resilience. The father carried scars softened by hope. Together they stood not as victims of loss, but as witnesses of transformation. A fortune worth $250 million lay recorded in catalogs, locked in safes, displayed under museum glass. But the greater fortune remained rooted in planks hammered straight, in laughter echoing under rafters, in two lives discovering that ruin can grow into promise. That is how sorrow's house became sanctuary again. Not because coins glittered, not because documents told tales of nobility, but because one father and one child chose to rebuild themselves in step with stone and timber. Transformation was never about gold. It was about finding life inside walls once steeped in silence. Dusk fell across the villa's courtyard, the final light bending through repaired windows until stone glowed amber. The father stood at the center, hands resting on railings once rusted, now straightened, strong again. Beside him, the boy balanced on the edge of a fountain base, arms spread wide, eyes fixed on the horizon. For a moment, quiet claimed the air, not heavy like before, but soft, like an exhale finally released. The courtyard, once choked by vines and silence, now carried voices again. Birds nested in trees, trimmed back to health. Wind swirled without sounding mournful. The father looked around and marveled. This was no longer a ruin reflecting grief. It had come alive, just as they had. And in that renewal he felt the weight of memory loosen ever so slightly, transformed into gentler presence. He thought of the first day, dust choking their throats, exhaustion and sorrow pressing harder than the cracked beams. He thought of the single gasp his son had made, that tiny sound which began the unraveling of secrets. And he realized how far they had walked since. Ruin had not swallowed them. Instead, ruin had opened. The boy clutched the fragment of map he carried, edges frayed from constant folding. He held it up as though it were a banner, grinning. "It led us here," he said, "not just about treasure, but to this very moment, standing together, watching sunset pour warmth into corners once drowned in mildew." His father bent to meet his gaze, seeing in those eyes both the weight of their shared past and the spark of the future. What startled the father most was the absence of bitterness. For so long, grief twisted every smile into pain. Now, when he watched his child laugh, he didn't feel betrayal of memory. He felt continuation, as if his wife's spirit threaded itself through that laughter, through this courtyard, through the house that cradled them. The villa had once symbolized despair. Now it pulsed with promise. He whispered softly, "We found life hidden here." The boy nodded, sliding his hand into his father's grip strong. "And not just gold, right?" The father smiled weakly, eyes damp. "Not just gold." They stood side by side, two silhouettes against the falling sun. Reporters would come again. Officials would call. Legal papers still sat in piles upstairs. Yet in this instant, amidst lantern light beginning to glow, none of that mattered. What mattered was survival turned to healing, loss turned to legacy. The boy looked outward, map fragment fluttering, as if daring horizons to bring further mystery. His father followed his gaze and thought sorrow had tried to hollow them out, but discovery had filled them instead. Whatever else the world demanded, here remained their truth. This house given back to laughter, this bond reforged inside hidden chambers. So the closing image is simple. A courtyard once echoing with silence, now echoing with breath, with footsteps, with hope. Father and child stand together, no longer searching only for escape, but for continuation. Their treasure lies not only in vaults or in catalogs, but in the promise that even from ruin, a story can rise full of wonder. And if you have felt the pull of this journey, subscribe for more strange, uncanny stories. Because sometimes the most extraordinary secrets begin with a quiet gasp in the dark.